All right, then let's pivot back to one of the lead stories at this hour, the Africa Climate Summit. Conversations around emissions trading systems are front and center at that event. Let's bring in Reshma Shah. She's the head of carbon markets at FSD Africa, joining us live on the program tonight. Reshma, thank you for your time this evening. So let's start with a very broad overview of where we stand today. Europe has had a centralized emissions trading system in place since 2005. Are there any regional or national emissions trading systems on the continent here in Africa at the moment?
Yeah, so here, looking at the continent at the moment, we don't really have any emissions trading systems. The closest we get is probably around carbon taxation, and the closest of that is South Africa at the moment, with its domestic tax position on carbon. There are other countries looking at emissions trading systems, incorporating them within legislation as well as taxation, but at this point in time, we don't have any active emissions trading systems in Africa.
COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan last year, that ended with a fair bit of controversy. Among other things, it was encouraging developed economies, which are the largest historical greenhouse gas emitters. They're being encouraged to contribute $300 billion a year in climate finance. The idea is to scale that up to $1.3 trillion a year at COP30 in Brazil this year. Where does carbon trading fit into that goal?
Yeah, so that's quite a controversial point at this point in time in the African continent, because a lot of people believe that any sale of carbon credits shouldn't actually be included within the climate finance flow into Africa. However, the money that's actually being included around the development of carbon projects should be counted towards that. And what we're seeing at the moment, which is 3% of climate finance in Africa, that we're not really seeing climate finance more broadly. Forget about the carbon projects. There are a number of initiatives, even as FSD Africa, that we've been running, including our current accelerator, the Carbon Accelerator Program for the Environment, where we're specifically looking at how can we increase this flow of capital, not just from an international perspective, but also local capital mobilization. And I say this is probably going to be one of the key focus areas if we want to increase mobilization of capital around areas such as carbon that not will have an effect just on climate, but can have a significant effect around nature biodiversity, but also around communities and economic development. And so this equation should not just be looking at the flow of capital, but should be looking at all those elements coming together at the same time as well.
Is part of the problem the question around a lack of transparency and credibility around these carbon offsets that are being sold into the open market? Because that would partly explain the resistance that we're seeing from some communities who will say, well, we have all this land, we've been living in this carbon sink for X number of decades or centuries or whatever the period of time is, but all this talk about carbon offsets doesn't really make sense unless that money is actually having a tangible impact and we can actually see what it's doing on the ground.
Yeah, so there's definitely an element of transparency and lack of transparency in many cases. There's also an area where we need to have more detailed guidelines and regulations that actually bring into account what is required from a benefit sharing perspective. And this is some of the work we've been doing at FSD in certain countries where we've been putting in quite detailed guidelines, working with communities to understand that, as well as benchmarking. But I think in addition to transparency and having the right regulations in place, it's also a value equation because what's being shared has to be of value. So we have to increase the pricing around carbon so that there's more revenue from carbon revenue, and there's more to be shared, not just with the community, but also the project developer, which in most cases is taking on a significant risk. So we should be looking at the distribution elements, but we should also be looking at the value equation as well.
One last question for you, because back in April, the now former head of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina, argued that carbon sinks in Africa are being grossly undervalued, with emission permits here costing around 1% of what they would in Europe. I believe the number he cited was about $3 to emit a ton of for carbon offset here in Africa versus around €200 over in the EU. Would using emission permit prices in the EU ETS as a sort of floor rate, would that be one way of solving that price arbitrage problem?
Yeah, so a floor rate can solve that problem, but that just gives you the minimum. We should also be looking at what components go into the value equation and the pricing for carbon. And I think when you look at Africa as a continent, it's not just the carbon emission side that is important and the carbon sinks, but also the effects that it has around nature that has more adaptation and resilience and more future aspects of climate, but also the core benefits that come around community and conservation. And I think all those need to come into it, not just in respect of the floor, but also in terms of what is the actual value of carbon credits.